my neighbor cutting his grass. It seems like whenever I'm out here on this back deck, people are cutting the grass. So, and meanwhile, my grass continues to grow and grow and grow, but theirs is neat and trimmed. Anyhow, I've been sitting here this morning. You guys know in another video I was talking about reading the book on R.C. Sproul's commentary on Matthew. This morning I've been working through this one on Revelation. It's not by Sproul, it's by Richard Phillips, and just excellent. So if you're like me, you're a little apprehensive to dig into Revelation because you've been so scarred by Adventism, this has been a really nice way to go into it. So I'm enjoying that. So anyway, but I was just sitting here and I found that somebody recently had reached out to one of my videos, I think from last night, and asked what I perceive as a very sincere question. The listener is Tan. I presume the last name is pronounced Awile or Awili, Ewelee, Tan Awili. And Tan's question was, can you provide some biblical proof of the Sabbath being a ceremonial law? And I want to say this. I'm going to try not to continue to focus on that argument. While I do believe it was actually ceremonial in its nature, oh my goodness, my wife has asked me, would you look under the sink and tell me if they're, guys, I have to go and answer her question. Oh, do what your wife asked you to do if you're a smart man. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. I know you guys were curious. They're Airwick, so let me just text her. Hopefully she won't have any more questions. So, appreciate your bearing with me. All right, so the sincere question I'm perceiving is, what is some of the biblical proof for the Sabbath being ceremonial? And now she's like, no plugins though. Okay, I promise you, I'm going to check one more thing. Please bear with me. I'm just I want to speak to you guys, but I also want to make my wife happy. You guys know how important that is. So I'll be right back, I promise. Oh, you guys are saints. You guys are saints. All right, so give me a second here. I don't care what she says now. All right. All right, so this is an incredibly valid and an incredibly important question, because any kind of argument that I or anybody is making, we need to be sure that it not only makes logical sense, but more importantly, that there needs to be biblical support for that. This is how I think about it. But before I get into it, I want to say one more time, my focus over the last 24 hours has changed, and I'm really bought into this idea of my focus. I want it to be on the greatest commandment, and that is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul, and all your strength. It's my belief that if I do that, if all of my efforts are on that, and I live my life out of that, every other commandment, even if tomorrow he has a new commandment for me, every other one I will be living according to. And the beautiful thing is, even when I fail, which I know I will, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ. My salvation is not in jeopardy just because I might fail in those. I think that is the far stronger argument about the Sabbath. That do I have to keep the Sabbath and things like that? Because if you're skipping this one, listen to me, everybody. If you're skipping the greatest one, even if you keep the Sabbath perfectly by the letter, you are still failing. If you miss the first one, the greatest commandment, even if you never commit murder, you're failing. You see what I'm saying? So, with that being said, I'm going to present today to Tan two arguments as to why I believe the Sabbath was ceremonial. So the first one that I have spoken about multiple times, I'm sure, is that when we see other ceremonial holy days, one thing we can do is we can go to Leviticus chapter 23. And in here, we see the following, and I'm going to go from the end of the chapter back to the beginning, okay? From the end, it goes the Feast of Booths, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of First Fruits, the Passover. And I don't think there's anyone who would argue, any theologian would argue, are these ceremonial holy days? Are these holy days or feasts that before God and before the law, we're supposed to be keeping to this day? I don't think anybody would say yes. And it's a sin that you haven't been keeping the Feast of Booths. I don't think anybody would do that. Until the very first one here is the Sabbath. So it says, let's just read a little bit. Leviticus chapter 23, starting in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts." And then he gets into the Sabbath, starting in verse 3. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places. Now, as you probably heard, some Adventists will want to make this distinction of sorts. They'll say, well, there's the Sabbath that's listed in the Ten Commandments, and then there's these other ceremonial Sabbaths. And you need to understand that. And there's a difference there. And that makes no sense to me whatsoever, as if one type of Sabbath could be ceremonial, but another is moral. That doesn't make sense. So I want to make this very, very clear. I'm not, Adventists tend to basically say, if you ask them and you push them, why is the Sabbath moral? Why is it a moral law? One thing they'll come to is they'll go, well, it's in the Ten Commandments. Because to the Adventist, they perceive, and they're not the only ones, there are other Christian denominations and pastors that go, well, this is the moral law. But particularly why they would say the Sabbath is a moral law is because it's part of the 10. And so that in my head, that argument means it's moral because of its proximity, because it's listed with other moral laws, therefore it must be moral. And I have to have a better argument, a better biblical argument than proximity. Another one they'll do is it was engraved in stone. And again, it can't be moral. It cannot be moral just because of the surface upon which it's engraved. Just this morning, I was reading some texts from, I think it's Amazon Killer or Amazon Warrior. And Amazon Warrior was basically reiterating what I've said before, and that is, people need to remember, when you read Exodus 20, understand something. This is what it actually says. Exodus 20. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God. And then he goes to the Ten Commandments. When you read in Exodus chapter 20, this is not the author of Exodus basically looking at the engraved stones and then writing them down. The author of Exodus is writing down what God literally said. When he got finished with the Ten Commandments, the people freaked out. Okay, and they basically, I can't find it exactly right here, but they said, "Listen, we can't handle hearing him anymore." My point is, the engraving of the law was the second method of communicating the law. In my opinion, him speaking the law was his obvious first intent. But because the people and their own failures and flaws, they then demanded, no, we listen, enough. Go talk to Moses if you want, but we can't handle this for whatever reason. So I find it funny that Adventists love to just stress this idea that it's engraved. Well, the engraving wasn't God's initial intent, by the way. So just so you know. All right. So the number one biblical argument that I would make that the Sabbath was ceremonial is it is listed. Okay, that's part of it. But the other thing I would say is, let's read some of the other ceremonial holy days. So let's just do the Passover for one. Okay. Starting in verse 4, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord, the holy convocations which you shall proclaim at the time appointed for them. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. You shall present a food offering to the Lord for 7 days. On the seventh day, it is a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. Let's read one more. Let's do the Feast of First Fruits, okay? And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and you shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, so that you may be acceptable. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. So that would be a Sunday. Anyhow, on the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And on the day when you wave the sheaf on a Sunday, you shall offer a male lamb, a year old without blemish, as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the grain offering with it shall be two. So the point I'm going to make to you here is one biblical reason I say ceremonial, the Sabbath ceremonial is, can you hear the similarities? The Sabbath, 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord and all your. And if you read the other ones, the language is incredibly similar. Let me give you another example. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not. Do you see similarity there? How like even the verbiage of it, thou shalt not. This is what I see. Okay, to me, when I read this, the Sabbath looks just like it. Another thing I'll say is, and this is not a biblical argument, and this is now more of a logical argument. You can't tell me, is there a day of the week? Is there an hour of the year in which a person can commit murder and not be found guilty? Is there a time or place? Is there a location where adultery can be committed and it not be counted as a sin? No. See, because the thing is this. With morality, it's a 24/7 universal thing. Understand something. You doing work on a Tuesday is not a sin. You doing work on a Wednesday is not a sin. Thursday, Friday, not a sin. Sunday, not a sin. Monday, not a sin. But this is the thing about a ceremonial law. That same thing that in and of itself, work, which is not, it is not immoral. If you do it on that day, it becomes a sin. You see what I'm saying? Is that how like ceremonial things, ceremonial holy days, normal things that are not bad in themselves, if they're done in that same time period, it's bad. That's a sign, in my estimation, of a ceremonial law. Okay, so that was number one. The fact that in Leviticus 23, it lists the Sabbath there. And again, Adventist is going to say, yeah, but there's those ceremonial Sabbaths, and then there's the seventh-day Sabbath in the Ten Commandments. I'll give you another one. I only going to give you two, but here's one I'll give you. This one is yet to be answered for me by any Adventist. I just said to you a second ago, I said morally, a moral law, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, adultery, the whole rest, the clearly non-arguable moral laws pretty much apply to everybody at all times, right? Okay, so let's listen, let's take a peek at the Sabbath commandment and see if there are any, dare I say, loopholes. Let's see if there are any, dare I say, loopholes. So let's read. Exodus 20, verse 8. All my Adventist friend knows that. It's remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter or your male servant or the female servant or the livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. You see, that right there has struck me as curious for years. If the Sabbath is moral, like it doesn't say, listen, the law doesn't say, thou shalt not kill you, your manservant, your maidservant, or the sojourners within the gates. None of you guys are allowed to murder. But this commandment does have this distinction that it makes about everybody who's not supposed to work. You're not supposed to work, or your son or your daughter. My wife is a saint. She just has no idea that I'm doing this right now. So do you want some gum? No. So anyhow, she's the best wife I could ever ask for. So there's no criticism of her. This has struck me for some time, that God is stressing who's not supposed to be doing work. And he stresses all these people. And the point is, those within the gates. If it were truly universal, if it were truly immoral to work on that day, then that would be true for everybody. No matter if you were in the gates or out of the gates. If you're doing work on the Sabbath, but this is why I believe it's ceremonial. So would be number two. Number three, and number three is the one that I have always held as being, in my opinion, the strongest argument for the fact that it was actually ceremonial and not. I'm just trying to figure out which gospel I want to go to, because it goes to, I'm going to go to Matthew. This story is told multiple times. I can remember hearing about it when I was a kid growing up as a Christian, that when Jesus and his disciples were going through the fields and they were breaking it up, they were being accused of breaking the Sabbath. And this thing I grew up hearing was, it is lawful to do good in the Sabbath. If your ox was in a ditch, you would get the ox out of the ditch, that kind of thing. So I've grown up with that. And so I've known this story for a long, long time. Now, hold on a second. Where... You guys help me out here. Where is that? If you guys have that in your Bible, it was Tan's name. And I didn't go back and do my due diligence really quick to find out where this passage is about them being accused of breaking the Sabbath. Do you guys know where that is? If you throw that into the chat for me, and it could save me some time. But again, this is what I think is the most powerful one. Lord, okay, here we go. So here's one in Luke. Again, this is told in multiple Gospels, but so starting in Luke 6, what I believe is the strongest example or proof, if you will, that the Sabbath was ceremonial. Okay? So Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. That's the header. Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 1. On the Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do in the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to them with him? And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now, let me find the correlating, let's see, I have this other Bible that will tell you, again, this section is also found over here. Let me see where else this one is found. Is it John? No. Well, doggone it. In one of the other Gospels, Jesus goes on to say, and no, I really do need to find the other one. I really need to find it. So, forgive me. Let me use my concordance here and find the other instance. You guys will please forgive me for not being prepared. This is what happens when Scott just decides to go live. Doggone it. There's guilt or guiltless. Six, 5. Matthew 12, 9 through 14. Matthew 9. Let me see if that's where it is. Matthew 9. You guys are great, and you're very patient, and I appreciate it. Matthew 9. There it is. There it is. Yeah. It's actually Matthew 12. Matthew 12. For some reason, I thought that's where it was. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so let's read it here. What we saw what Luke said. Here's what Matthew says. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields in the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do in the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him to eat, nor those who were with him, but only for the priest? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are," keyword, "and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." So, why, Scott, do you think this is the strongest? Because the Adventist wants to immediately argue a couple things, and they're really missing the point. They want to argue, but the disciples weren't really breaking the Sabbath. What the disciples were doing was they were breaking the laws that the Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, whoever had come up with. These extra, you can only walk 1 mile on the Sabbath. They were breaking those laws. They were, the Jews had come up with this thing that if you do this, then it's harvesting, and harvesting is work, and therefore if you do that on the Sabbath, you're breaking the Sabbath. And they want to, and that's what Jesus says. You are totally missing the point here. You are totally missing the point. What Jesus is doing here is what they don't want to see And what you and I must see is when the disciples are being accused of breaking a law, when they're being accused of breaking a law, okay, even if it's these fringe parts, what kind of law does Jesus compare it to breaking? He breaks it to when David, in desperation and hunger, excuse me, went into the temple and ate the bread of the presence. He did something that was not, what does he say here? He ate the bread of presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor those who were with him, but only for the priests. He was directly disobeying God's command. But it says here, and then it says also, or have you not read how the law, read in the law, how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless. In both of these scenarios, Jesus explains how there are absolutely going to be times that you, as a human being, are going to be able to, where your needs supersede the demand of this law. Your needs. The Sabbath was made for man, as a gift for man, not man for the Sabbath. Like here, man is subservient to the Sabbath. No. The gift is subservient to the master. And God said the Sabbath was made for you and I. Okay? The Sabbath commandment and these other laws, there are going to be times when your needs or my needs are more important. Adventists must know this in their heart of hearts. There's one big reason. I'm going to tell you a secret, a little insider. You guys ready? On the phone this morning, I was just talking to Tess the Prophet. Okay? Tess the Prophet and I were on the phone and just talking about, what he was going to do on his Sabbath, things like that, with tongue in cheek. Not trying to mock. But he and I both know people in healthcare. Listen to me. He and I both know people in healthcare. And as such, Adventists love this verse, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And so they love to take that loophole is exactly what Tess the Prophet and I used. We used the word loophole this morning. And it's a term I've used multiple times. Adventists love that loophole. If your ox is in a ditch, what do they use that one for? Well, if their car won't start, they'll call somebody to come and give it a jump. If their car is off the side of the road and they're in a wreck, their ox is in a ditch. So it's lawful, it's fine. They're not breaking the Sabbath if there's this emergency. They understand that. They understand this concept. And what I say to anybody is, give me an example of a moral law that has that type of a loophole. Give me a moral law where, well, listen, if you really need to eat, you can steal it. If you really are feeling like whatever, if you really like your neighbor's wife, you can sleep with her. It's okay. You can murder somebody. It's okay if you're really behind the eight ball, you can lie. It ceases to exist. But ceremonial laws, namely the Sabbath, and what God is showing you here is that they are subservient. The needs of believers are greater than. The needs of the believer are greater than the keeping or the key, the detail of this. So to me, like Adventists, they just reject this. They cannot see it. And I'm not going to try to even fault them. I'm not even going to try to fault them for that anymore. Maybe it's just that God has not opened their eyes to that, that they're just unable to see that. But for me, that light went on. And so for a long time, I have been stressing that. And I'm at a point now, and I was just talking to my buddy Adam about this last night. I'm like, it's not going to make a difference. I can present an Adventist or anybody with a million verses or of scripture to show that the Sabbath was ceremonial. It don't matter. They're just not taking it. It's so ingrained in them, they cannot escape it. They cannot get around it. And it requires an intervention from God himself to get them to that point. So instead, I think where I find myself today is my focus is simply going to be on the greatest commandment. And that is that when the Adventist wants to sit there and just chastise me or tell me how unintelligent I am, or, just the sarcasm, and I give sarcasm too, so I'm not above them in that regard. But I think my response is going to be, listen, if you feel, you go ahead and keep that Sabbath. Judge me all you want because I go on Sunday. That's perfectly fine. I don't care. All I'm trying to do is I'm trying to keep the greatest commandment, and that is to love the Lord my God with all my heart, my soul, and my mind, and my spirit, my strength, everything in my essence. And it's my belief that if I do that, everything else will fall in line. So, I hope, Tan Awili, I hope that this helps answer your question. It was a good question. I saw it as a genuine, sincere question. I hope it truly was, and I didn't just get baited into something bigger. But take that for what it's worth. If you have other questions, you or anybody that's here today, please feel free to let me know. I'll be happy to answer any question I can. Tomorrow is Lord's Day, so I hope you guys are going to be worshiping. And you guys take care of yourself. God bless. We'll see you next time.